For the past few days, I've been seeing a lot of comparisons of different Nintendo Switch 2 games that are third-party games on other platforms, and a lot of people are just knocking the Switch 2 versions of these games, and it doesn't really make sense to me. Like, yes, the Switch 2 version looks worse. I don't think it's as dramatic as some people say, but look at the size difference of the Switch 2 compared to the PS5 or an Xbox Series X. Like, the Switch 2 is not trying to compete in terms of power with these consoles. It's a portable device. Now, I don't think that means that games can look awful on Switch 2 and we shouldn't criticize it, but I've been very impressed from some games I've played, especially on handheld mode in the Switch 2. Like, I played the Final Fantasy VII Remake demo, and it looks really good on Switch 2. I did not have many complaints. Would it look better if I played on PS5? Yeah, but it's not the point of the system, and it seems like a lot of people are just missing that point. Like, if you're buying a game, a third-party game on the Switch 2, it's for one of two reasons. One, you just don't have any other platforms. You don't have a PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and I think most people probably don't fit into that category. I'm sure there's plenty of people that fit into that category, but more likely someone just wants to play that game on the go. Something like a Final Fantasy VII, where you're going to spend 30, 40, maybe even longer hours playing that game. It's a lot easier to get through it if you could bring it on the go, if you can just play it in short bursts rather than having to actually turn on your console or turn on your PC. Like, that's what the appeal of the Switch 2 is for third party. I'm not saying we shouldn't compare them at all. Like, I'm interested in seeing how the Switch 2 version holds up. And I think if a game gets ported to Switch 2 and it runs poorly and it just looks way worse than it should, then that should be called out. But knocking the Switch 2 for not being as graphically good as the other systems just doesn't seem like fair criticism to me. If it's worse than like a PS4 or Xbox One version, then yeah, that could be a fair criticism, but I haven't really seen any games like that. For me personally, as someone who has a gaming PC, a PS5, and a Switch 2, I play different games in all three of them, so it can be tough for me to spend a lot of time in like a big RPG or something, so those types of games I would definitely prefer having on my Switch 2. For PS5, I play more multiplayer games on there. Like, I play like Rocket League, Dead by Daylight when I play, like, those are games I'll play on PS5, as well as like more shorter story games, if that makes sense. Like, games that aren't going to take you 40 hours to beat. Like Resident Evil Requiem, I think the Switch 2 version like looks impressive so far, but I'm getting it on my PS5 simply because it's a game I'm going to sit down and play, and if I'm going to sit down and play a game, going for the PS5 version's a no-brainer. And I do have a gaming laptop. I say gaming PC, I mean gaming laptop, and that I use more for other multiplayer games that I don't play on PS5, like games I want to use a keyboard and mouse for, as well as a lot of smaller indie games, or when I just find a game for like super cheap on Steam. But anyway, going back to the main topic of these graphical comparisons, I think the most important thing is that it runs well. Like, I'm willing to give up some graphical fidelity for 60 frames per second. I think Resident Evil Requiem does run at 60 FPS on Switch 2. I could be wrong on that, but if so, that's very impressive. Because that's the thing, that if a game just doesn't run well on Switch 2, that deserves a lot more criticism than it not looking as good. But something I definitely do notice is that it seems like the Switch 2 has a harder time showing hair. Like, if you look at characters' hair in any game, you will notice it doesn't look as good compared to the PS5. Like, it's a lot more noticeable than like something like textures, in my opinion. And I think that's something a lot of people have been focusing on. But I don't think the Switch 2 is so far underpowered compared to the PS5 and Xbox Series X, where it's just not going to run most of those games. I'm sure there's games on there that just will barely work on a Switch 2 that would really need to be like downgraded to work on there. But I think the majority of games on those platforms will work on Switch 2 if it's just adjusted. And I'm actually pretty happy the Switch 2 is getting a lot of third-party support now. Now, I think the Direct the other day was pretty bad, since literally it was only ports pretty much outside of like a couple new things. But it's good to just take advantage of this time, just where the Switch 2 can play most of the same games as other platforms, because once we get to like the PS6 and the next Xbox, if that even happens, the Switch 2 is just not going to be able to compete with them. Like, it's going to be previous gen versions, and it's just not going to hold up. Like, if we go back to the Switch 1, the original Switch could compete with the Xbox and PS4 in terms of power a little bit. Like, I think it was a little more limited, but it would run a lot of those games. But of course, there were the drawbacks then, and by the time the PS5 and Series X came out, it couldn't compete with those anymore. Like, that's why third-party support for AAA games just started to fall off a cliff. Because I think most people who want the convenience of being able to play games on the go are willing to give up a little bit of performance, like a little bit of graphical fidelity, as long as it's still the same game. But if you get to a point where it just looks like a completely different game, where it just runs horribly, like if 60 FPS looks great on PS5 and a choppy 30 FPS, and just looks completely watered down on Switch, then someone might just not even want to bother with the Switch 2 version and just give up that convenience. Now, another point I've seen people make is, yes, the Switch 2 is smaller and portable, but it's also coming out 5 years after the PS5 and Series X. And yes, that's true, but it's still hard for a console as small as the Switch 2 to compete with those. And there's powerful Steam Decks, the Xbox ROG Ally, which is pretty powerful. the better versions of those are just far more expensive, and the Switch 2 isn't trying to be that premium. Like, it is a premium console. It's $450 base. Like, that's not cheap. Like, it is an expensive piece of hardware, but Steam Decks and Xbox ROG Ally can get close to $1,000. Like, for the ROG Xbox Ally, the cheapest one is $600, and the more expensive one is $1,000. And for Steam Decks, I'm not exactly sure. I think there is actually one cheaper than the Switch 2. I don't even think it's in stock, though. I think the cheapest one was like $400, and it's like the very limited version of it. And also, if I remember correctly, I think the cheapest version, it was actually discontinued. And none of this is to say that the ROG Ally or Steam Deck isn't worth it, because if you play a lot of Steam games, or a lot of Steam games that you could use a controller for, and you want that better performance, and you want the customization, and you don't want to deal with Nintendo or whatever reason, like, there is a lot of good reasons to get these, but again, you're paying more. That might not be what you're looking for if you want a platform to play Nintendo games also. So I do understand why the Switch 2 isn't more powerful. And then if Nintendo got into the market of having like two different versions, like from the start, where there's, let's say, the base $450 version, and then they made like a $600 version, that's just not as easy for the developers to have to develop two different versions of it. And I know Xbox has this with the Series S and Series X. I don't know all the differences with that. I don't have either of those consoles, but the Xbox is basically just like a PC console at this point, and the Series S is still far more powerful than a Switch 2. Like, it's still going to play all the same games. It's just going to be, I guess, a slightly different performance. I don't know. You can let me know in the comments if you have any more insight on this. But to really talk more about this point, I'm very happy with the Switch 2's performance of games so far. Like, there's been no game I've played on it that I felt ran poorly. Now, I just may have not played enough games. There may be one that is, but there's games like I tried out Fortnite on Switch 2 just like for curiosity, because it was horrible on Switch 1. If any of you have played Fortnite on the Switch 1 in recent years, it's unplayable. And I think actually maybe shutting down on Switch this year, because it's just like, it doesn't load in anything, it lags, and for a multiplayer game like that just doesn't work. Switch 2, I don't really like playing it in handheld mode. It just doesn't feel good to play Fortnite like that, or a lot of multiplayer games like that, in my opinion. But it runs perfectly fine. Like, there's not really any noticeable difference between the Switch 2 version and the PS5 version, for example. Like, it's gonna look a little better, yeah, but comparing it, it's not anything dramatic. I'm just happy that Nintendo seems to be getting more third-party support now. No, I think the Direct was still very poor. I thought it was one of the worst Directs ever, maybe even the worst Direct, just because it was just ports, which isn't exactly what I want out of a Direct. But I am happy that they are getting third-party support. I hope developers keep making quality versions of Switch 2 games. Like, what we're seeing with Resident Evil Requiem, it's looking great. What we're seeing with Pragmata, that looks great. And I think before judging a Switch 2 version, just say, like, is this the version you want? Like, are you willing to give up some graphics for the portability? Like I said, for me, it just depends on the game. If you're fortunate to have multiple platforms to play on, I don't really think there's much of a reason to complain about a Switch 2 version, as long as it's reasonable, runs well, and looks good enough. I think that's really all you could ask for from a Switch 2 version. Do let me know your thoughts, though. Like, do you think that we should really be comparing the Switch 2 graphics to PS5 and then using that against the Switch 2? Like, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe.